Hello, my name is Marcel de Jong. I'm Technical Team Lead for M&E in North America, and I'm going to go through another Arnold workflow exercise. And in this case, we're going to use a little bit of paint effects to generate some quick vegetation. Then I'll show how to actually reconnecting things to an AI standard surface, an Arnold shader, to properly render transparency alpha. I'll also show the new alpha functionality, the alpha cut functionality in the viewport, as well as point light shadows, and then we'll get into Dash to manually randomize the individual elements to then go ahead and render that out. So with that, let's look at some images. So this is essentially what I'm after. That's a very simple preset. It's one of the rosemary brushes, I believe, that we have with paint effects. Here's one with depth of field to kind of focus in on that middle area. There's still a little bit of noise there. That's because I had my AA sample set to fairly low, but we can crank that up obviously to up the quality. So let's go ahead and jump into the software. And the preset that I'll use is in the content browser. It's called rosemary.ml. So when you select that, we can go ahead and increase the size of the brush just a bit, maybe to something that big. And I can start planning some or dragging some strokes into the scene until I get something that I like. And I just want a single kind of rosemary representation, and I want something that's fairly upright. And of course, what I would need to do with this in order to be able to render this is convert this to geometry. So let's go to Modify, Convert Paint Effects to Polygons. Once we do this, we get a group with two meshes, the branches as well as the leaves. And we no longer really need the actual stroke, the original stroke. Now, when I turn this on, you can see that it looks correct, but the problem is with sorting. So you can see that some of the polys that are in the back are cutting into the ones at the front, and vice versa. So that's a real issue. Now, before I fix that in the viewport, I want to reconnect my shader. In the Hypershade window, we can simply graph the rosemary shader that represents the leaves. In other words, the one that actually has an alpha associated with it. And when you select the shader, it's a Fong currently, and switch this into maybe like an AI standard surface shader. It doesn't do a conversion from a legacy to a new AI standard surface shader. So it doesn't do an AI standard to an AI standard surface. It just simply converts the Fong to an AI standard surface, but then that also means it has to disconnect any of the connections that it had between textures. So what I'm going to do is just simply reconnect this by using the color texture here, click and then click. That's a new feature in 2018 where you can just click on the two channels that you want to connect rather than have to try and pick this up and then drag it over. We also no longer need this because we're not connecting it to, we don't have to do a reverse because we're not connecting it to the transparency channel, which is effectively an inverse of the alpha. By simply selecting the shader and going to geometry, I can drag and drop the alpha onto the opacity channel. And so now this is working. So this shader, even though I converted it and it disconnected textures, is currently assigned to the actual leaves, the physical leaves of my geometry. So we're pretty much done with this. The only thing that I have to make sure of is that when you grab the geometry, you turn off the opaque switch here, so that it's actually allowing for the alpha to work. So with that, I also want to see that in the viewport. So there are two things that I want to rectify. One is the sorting of polys in the back and the front. And then two would be the clipping of the alpha texture of your geometry. Under object sorting, there's alpha cut. And when you turn that on, you can see it's properly clipping the alpha. And it's also sorting this properly now. So the only thing that is not turned on here, because we have a front and a back to the geometry and both have an individual leaf, I can turn on two-sided lighting and you can see how that kind of fixes that problem. So if I get a little closer right now and I tumble this around, you can see that the sorting is actually working correctly. So with that, we can then start to figure out how we want to populate our scene with this. So I have a group here of my geometry. And I just simply need to go in and actually replicate this a number of times in Z and X. and then randomize it using something called dash. And we'll use dash in the channel box to randomize things like rotation as well as scale. So with this, let's copy this and move this over maybe 6 times or so. 6-7 times is fine. So we have 6 copies of that. And we're going to do this again for the 6 copies. We'll copy it 6 times in the X direction. Something like that, and then kind of frame this in a way where, maybe this is the angle I want to use later on for rendering. Randomizing position, rotation, scale, etc. can be done using something called dash. The reason why we're using dash is because dash is has one of the fastest script execution times. So it's something that we can actually access and then execute very quickly from within the channel box. So with all the Rosemary groups selected, let's go ahead and grab all of them. I can highlight a channel like Rotate X, for example, holding Alt right mouse button, and then use something like a Randomize command, R, and then parentheses between 0, 360, and parentheses close, execute. So with that, we also want to go ahead and modify the scale, and I'll select scale X, Y, and Z all at the same time, so we'll keep it uniform. You might want to just give Y a slightly different scale than X and Z to randomize that. Not too much, because it's going to start looking like stretching. And we'll type in like a random scaling value between 1 and 2, for example, and execute that. So now that we have that, we also might want to build in a little bit of a translation offset where we hit Alt right mouse button and randomize that between 0 and 2, for example, and lift some of these up, whereas some of them will stay behind. The next thing would be to simply frame this, create a light, an Arnold light, and I'll create a physical sky. A physical sky is essentially the same as creating a sky dome light and then applying a physical sky, AI physical sky texture. By selecting physical sky here, it creates both nodes at the same time. So let's render this by just hitting the render switch and see what comes up. We'll give it a second here. You can see the illumination is just a default illumination. As it starts to resolve for the sampling values, we're going to start to see this dense kind of concentration of leaves, of rosemary leaves, appear in the render view. You can also see that it's clipping correctly. So, in terms of rendering the leaves the way you want it to, where the alpha needed to be clipping it, that is currently working. So I think that's pretty much it. With that, we can go ahead and render this at a much larger resolution and get a better sense of the detail that's in this scene. Thank you very much.